Um, that's kind of hard to say because I just it's something I've always done ever since I was a child. I've always told stories in one form or another, and as soon as I learned to write, I was writing stories. Um, in my teenage years and in my 20s, I used to steal exercise books from my school, like big piles of exercise books, and write endless fantasy novels in them, mostly kind of modeled on Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion stories. So stories of magical quests and magical artifacts and immortal heroes, reincarnated heroes. And I did that just for fun, really. I didn't show those stories to anybody. They were just for me. Um, then what happened was I started to write novels. I started to write and submit novels through my 20s, but they were terrible. They were really bad because I didn't know anything about structure. I was really bad on structuring a story. My approach to writing a novel was write chapter one, go and make a cup of tea, write chapter two, rinse and repeat, and just keep on going. I'd write these huge, shapeless, endless stories, and then I'd submit them to publishers, and the publishers would politely say, "No, this is not publishable." Um, and at the same time, because I was reading a lot of comics, and really a lot of what I was reading for pleasure was in the graphic medium. It was comic books. I started to do comics journalism. I started to write reviews and articles for fanzines, for amateur magazines. And at a certain point, it was my wife who said, "You should submit a story idea. You should try and get a comic published. You know, this is what you read, and you should definitely write what you read," which I think is always true. Um, so I pitched some stuff to a guy named Martin Skidmore, who was running a very short-lived British independent press called Apocalypse Press, which grew out of Trident Comics, um, and they accepted a couple of my ideas. They published about 7 pages in the end in an anthology title, but that was my first published story, and it was my sort of introduction to actually getting paid for my writing. Although the check bounced, so I didn't get paid in the end. I got a check, but I didn't get paid. Um, but an awful lot of things came out of that. I started to meet other people, writers and artists, who were working on the British indie scene and the American indie scene. I started throwing ideas around, throwing pictures in to Malibu and then to Caliber, to a lot of these small press publishers, until finally I got a commission from DC about 10 years later. Um, so I did a book for Caliber called Inferno, which was it was set in hell. It starts with the main character dying and going to hell, and it's all about the power structures in hell, um, where it turns out that he's a very powerful player because he's the reincarnation of a medieval sorcerer. So I wrote 5 issues of this book over 2 years. Caliber put out some lovely books, but Jesus, their publishing schedules were terrible. It took an awful long time for anything to happen. But every time I got an issue of this book out, I would send it to the Vertigo editors, especially to Elisa Whitney, who was the editor on Sandman. And she wrote back to me and said, yeah, there's some interesting stuff in this comic. Why don't you pitch for our new Sandman Universe book, The Dreaming? And I pitched maybe a dozen ideas for The Dreaming, just one-page synopses, little tiny summaries. None of them were ever accepted. I was talking to Elisa for like a year and a half, but not getting anywhere. And then at a certain point, um, The Dreaming became a continuity book with Caitlin Kiernan writing it. It wasn't an anthology anymore, so there was no point pitching for it. So I kind of gave up. Um, but then I did another book for Caliber called Dr. Faustus, and I didn't bother to send it to Elisa because I thought that door had closed. But the artist on the book, Mike Perkins, sent her a copy. And she called me up out of the blue. She just called me up one day and she said, we want to do this new book, Sandman Presents, and we want a story with Lucifer as the main protagonist. Would you like to write it? And I said, yes, please. Yes, I would love to. I would love to. She said, how much would you like to write it? Because we need a pitch in about 2 days and we need a script in about a week. They were really close to deadline. What had happened was they'd already solicited this book with another writer attached, and that had fallen through for whatever reason, so they needed to fill that gap quickly. So I just didn't eat or sleep for 2 days. I just sat at the keyboard and turned out what became the Morning Star option, the first 3-issue miniseries. And then Elisa went on maternity leave. So again, I thought, well, the door's closed. I've always been kind of a pessimistic guy. I suddenly didn't know anybody at Vertigo again. But I took a chance. I went to San Diego that year, and I met up with Shelley Bond, who was Shelley Roberg back then, who was another Vertigo editor whose books I greatly admired. We sort of we didn't exactly hit it off at first, but she was interested in the stuff I was pitching, and she said, "Yeah, when I go back to New York, we'll talk a little bit further." And it became that conversation became the Lucifer Monthly, but it took quite a long time to happen. It always seemed like I was walking backwards, like every time something good happened, it kind of it was followed up by a setback, one step forward, 2 steps back. Neil Gaiman was the creative consultant on the entire Sandman Presents line and on the entire run of Lucifer the Monthly. And he was great. He was just absolutely wonderful as a collaborator. He was really generous with his time. He was helpful with opinions and advice and suggestions without kind of trying to shut down the stuff that I was setting up. He was just a great sounding board. He didn't seem to mind at all, that I was playing with his characters and with his concepts and in his universe. He was totally relaxed about that, and I think he has been ever since. There've been lots of other Sandman projects, and he's always actively involved with them, and I think always in a really positive way. He only said no to me twice in the whole time that I was writing Lucifer. One was I had a story in which Lucifer meets death, and Lucifer says, "You don't have any claim on me," and she says, "Well, I wouldn't have anywhere to put you in any case." And the way that dialogue played out, it suggested that death had a realm in the same, had a kingdom in the same way that dream has a kingdom, the dreaming. And Neil said, "That's not how it works. That there is no place which is like the realm of the dead, that death presides over." So he asked me to change that dialogue, which I did. And then the other time I pitched a story arc that had Rose Walker in it. And Neil said that if he ever came back to Sandman, he would want to tell the story of Rose Walker's pregnancy. So he said, could you just leave that character alone? Everything else that I did, he was totally on board with, and we talked. We had lots of long phone calls. I'd never met him personally at that time. I'd never been in the same room with him, but we talked on the phone an awful lot, and I learned an awful lot. I think it's fairly obvious that when I start writing Lucifer, I'm very much copying Neil's storytelling styles and structures, because it seemed to me that Sandman had done something that had never been done before in continuity comics. It was a novel in comic form, and the way he interwove the longer arcs with the freestanding single issue stories, and the way those single issues then fed back into the fabric of the whole, I just thought was absolute genius. So I kind of learned to write comics by copying Neil's approach, and I think it took me until issue 4 of Lucifer, which is Born with the Dead, the first Elaine Belloc story, before I kind of had the confidence to like start developing my own voice rather than pastiching Neil's. I've only seen like 2 or 3 episodes. The thing is, I don't watch much networked American drama. I watch a lot of HBO. I watch a lot of Netflix originals and Amazon Prime originals. But the stuff that gets shown on networks like Fox or ABC, it tends to be a little bit sort of like, I don't want to say bland because that's a kind of like a value judgment, and it sounds like I'm condemning it out of hand. But it tends to be a little bit more aimed at a mass market. So in some ways, the ideas are presented more simply. So I've not really given it a fair chance. I've watched a couple of episodes which I thought were quite fun, but I've never seriously got into it. I don't have any direct involvement in it. Um, I don't think Neil has any direct involvement in it either. I know that the showrunner Joe is a big fan of the comic, and that he has plans to bring in other characters from the comic. You know, we've seen Amenadiel and Mazikeen, obviously. I think he wants to bring in other characters. At some point, I'll probably sit down and watch it, but I can't really comment beyond that. Yeah, the last time we see him, he is flying into the void outside of creation, this kind of infinite nothingness. And I think the voiceover narration says it's not clear whether the nothingness swallows him or whether he becomes merged with it, or whether he sort of succeeds in conquering it, imposing himself upon it. Um, I think it's a deliberately ambiguous note. He leaves creation. He leaves his father's um, universe behind and goes somewhere else, even though there is nowhere else. He goes into the nowhere, because it's the only way he can square the circle. It's the only way he can find a place where he can be free and be himself. The only place that is outside of his father's influence. I mean, the whole story really is about the struggle we have with our parents, the way our parents shape us, and the way, as we grow older, we sort of pull against that influence and try to find a space that's just ours, a self that's just ours. And it's kind of, in a way, it's a struggle that's doomed to failure, but it's a struggle that never ends. You keep on doing it. It's about a guy whose father was a famous writer, like one of the most famous writers in the world. Um, and the father, Wilson Taylor, has obviously based his fictional hero, his boy wizard hero, on his real son. So Tom Taylor, the protagonist of The Unwritten, is the real life person on whom the boy wizard, Tommy Taylor, was based. In a way, it's kind of what we were doing. We were taking the story of Christopher Milne, the son of the British novelist A. Milne, who did the Winnie the Pooh stories. So that in the Winnie the Pooh stories, the little boy who sort of hangs out with the animals in the Hundred Acre Wood with Winnie the Pooh and Piglet and Tigger and Rabbit, Christopher Robin, he's based on Christopher Milne, the author's own child. And Christopher Milne grew up hating that, hating the fact that he was famous for something that his father had done, famous as a character in his father's work. He got bullied at school because of it, and it kind of dogged him through the rest of his life. Everybody knew him. Everybody knew him. He was a celebrity on somebody else's terms, and he really resented it. He said in his autobiography, he said, "I felt as though my father had stolen my childhood from me and left me nothing but the empty fame of being his son." So what we did was we took that situation, but imagine if instead of writing Winnie the Pooh, imagine if your father had written the Harry Potter books. That's kind of the situation. Everybody in the world seems to know those stories. They've either read the books, they've seen the movies, they've played the games, they've written fan fiction. Um, and Tom has spent his entire life trying to pull himself away from that and do something himself that will make him famous, that will allow him to earn a living. and stand on his own 2 feet. And he keeps failing. And then at a certain point, it becomes apparent that he can do magic, and he starts to meet characters from the Tommy Taylor novels. He meets the little winged cat, who is Tommy Taylor's familiar. He meets the vampire Count Ambrosio, who is the bad guy in the books. And the horrible prospect begins to dawn on him that maybe he is just a fictional character. Maybe he's not his father's son. Maybe his father's fictional creation somehow brought into the real world. And the more he tries to prove that, the more the evidence begins to stack up that he's not a real boy at all. In a way, it's the same story as Lucifer, just seen through a different lens. In Lucifer, it's about trying to be you, finding your own autonomy, finding your own space, and that's kind of what Tom is doing as well. But the unwritten is more about stories. It's about the power of stories. It's about how stories define us, how stories create us, how stories tell us who we are, both as individuals and as a society. I guess I came into Hellblazer immediately after Brian Azzarello. Brian Azzarello, at that time, the only American writer who'd ever written John Constantine. And of course, Azzarello took John to America. And I think to a large extent took the magic out of the stories, or at least made the magic be less of a focus in the stories. His John is involved in kind of almost gritty crime scenarios. It becomes a very crime noir kind of book. And to some extent, it's not even John's story. It's the story of S.W. Manor, and the payoff is more about that character, and John's arc is sort of incidental to that. I think what I wanted to do was to bring John back to England, to bring him back to his roots, to bring back the idea of him as the laughing magician, which I think was Neil's formulation for him. A guy who wins his battles by being the smartest guy in the room and the biggest smart ass in the room. Somebody who talks back on behalf of humanity to angels and gods and demons. A kind of trickster character. I wanted to bring back that vibe to it. The other thing I did on Hellblazer was exactly what I did on Lucifer. I tied all of the stories together. It's the same structure as Lucifer, which is the same structure as Sandman. Long arcs with individual standalone stories in between, and the standalones actually tie into the arcs in unexpected ways. So I approached it kind of novelistically. And I think you asked me what I'm most proud of. I think probably the very last story I wrote, The Gift, which has John basically saying his farewell to magic. Obviously, it wasn't a permanent farewell, but I thought that said a lot about my take on the character and my take on the backstory of the character. So Crossing Midnight was a Vertigo series that I wrote in between Lucifer and the Unwritten, which never really found an audience. It only lasted for 19 issues. It was not a great success sales-wise. In fact, it would have been cancelled after the first year, but Paul Levitz, who was then the publisher at DC, really liked the book and really liked what we were doing with the book. So he gave us a little bit of extra time to wrap it up, and he warned us when it was going to be cancelled. He said, you have to issue until issue 19. So can you tie all your story arcs together by then? So it's a story about two Japanese children, siblings, who live in Nagasaki. They were born on either side of midnight. One twin is born immediately before, the other twin is born immediately after, and that kind of that determines their fates. One of them is a magical adept. She has magic abilities. The other seems to have nothing at all, seems to have no special abilities, although as we later learn, he has something else, that there's something else that's special about him. And these children are, because of their heritage, they kind of belong as much to the world of the yokai, the nature spirits, as they do to the world of humans. And at a certain point, one of these spirits, one of these yokai, Aratsu, comes and claims Toshi, the sister, as his servant, and takes her away. And her brother decides that he's going to find her again and bring her home safely. In a way, it's the story of the Snow Queen, you know, the Hans Christian Andersen story. It's kind of a Japanese inflected version of that. The idea behind it and the way I sold it was there's some absolutely amazing Far Eastern horror, body horror. That this is the time. There was the time of Ringu, of Dark Water, of The Grudge, and so on. So amazing Japanese and Korean horror, and also there's some amazing Japanese fantasy coming out from Studio Ghibli. And so I said, yeah, what if you sort of try to bring those two aesthetics together and do a book that kind of plays with both sets of concepts. But it didn't work. It didn't work. I mean, it was fun to do. And I'm still proud of what we achieved. In particular, yeah, the fact that it was reviewed in a Japanese magazine, and they basically said we only got two things wrong in our depiction of Japanese culture in the first trade. One of them was to do with cooking, and the other one was to do with street signs. So, you know, we did a lot of things right, or at least we were able to sort of we were able not to misrepresent the Japanese setting, which we were quite proud of. I wanted basically to do exactly what Forrest had done with the character. If you look at the 1960s stories, it's kind of, they were revolutionary for their time simply because they had a heroine who was sexually emancipated, who was polyamorous, completely unapologetic about her libido, and that was a statement in the 1960s, a radical statement. So what I wanted to do was something like that, a sci-fi story which would deal with issues of sex and gender that are relevant to the present time, and to put a sort of a very confident, self-actualized woman at the core of those stories. So obviously, my Barbarella is bisexual, pansexual. She's, if something turns her on, it doesn't matter what shape that something is, or even what species that something is. There's a story. The first story is about religious attitudes to sex and about religious censure and stricture of sex. Some of the later stories, I guess as it went on, I lost track of the sexual side of things and just wrote straight sci-fi. But that was the original plan anyway, to kind of bring her up to date without changing the character or the core idea. I think it was a very sad day when Karen left, and it was a very sad day when Shelley left. I think Karen, obviously Karen created Vertigo. I think Karen left her mark. She defined what Vertigo was, and there was nothing out there like that at the time. If you look at the market now, there are so many companies that are kind of doing what Vertigo was doing in the 80s, but it was completely unique when she first started it going, and she was a great editor. She was a great great at the big picture, great at the details. She was really supportive of her creators, and she was willing to take risks. She was willing to read ideas that were a little bit out there, a little bit nutty. And I think after she left, Shelley Bond kind of took on that same mantle. I think Elisa Whitney and Pornsak Pichetto, they were all, they're some of the best comics editors I've ever met, and they were trained by Karen. a lot of them started as assistants to Karen. So there was kind of like a family, really, at Vertigo. And there was definitely a sense of shared values and shared perspectives. So yes, something very vital and important disappeared when Karen left the company. I'm still in touch with her. I still talk to her from time to time, and I feel very grateful that I was able to be part of that era. That I was writing at Vertigo and she was still there, and she edited me on some of the issues of Crossing Midnight. I think there's a different model now, isn't there? If you look at what DC is doing now with books that would have been Vertigo titles, instead they're creating these kind of micro imprints that are curated by a single creator, like the Young Animals books, where Gerard Way was in charge of that imprint, and the Hill House books, where Joe Hill assembled a set of teams to write a set of books that would have a similar aesthetic. I think that's a different model. I think that's a powerful model that's producing some really interesting work. But yeah, I still miss Karen and Shelley and Pornsec and Elisa. That would be really exciting. I've only been to South America once in my life, and that was Peru and Bolivia. I had a holiday mostly in Peru, and then a little bit around La Paz. I don't, I've never ever seen any of the rest of the continent, and I know that Argentina is meant to be an amazingly beautiful country. Thank you very much for the invitation. Obviously, it depends on what's going to happen with COVID, with the pandemic, and as you say, with the world coming back to normal. But yeah, I would love to come if it's possible.
Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure and gracias. Te agradecemos. Me gusta tu trabajo, te queremos. Well, if there's something else you would like to tell us, something we haven't asked, the moment is now. And if not, well, thanks a lot, and it's been a pleasure, Mike.
Been my pleasure too. Nice to talk, guys. And again, thank you very much for the invitation. That's really exciting.